Nazis. Is that something that America is supposed to back? I always thought that we were supposed to be against the Nazis. I don't know. Maybe I'm just missing something here, but is the opposite of what we see in the Washington Post right now. Gary, if you could throw that one up there, that headline, we've just been found. I think it was earlier today. It is, yeah. The United States has officially lifted a ban on sending weapons to a controversial Ukrainian military unit, which is called the Azov Battalion or Azov Brigade, which is a neo-Nazi group. Now, as I'm going to show you here in a little while, some claim no, actually it's not. It's just a regular battalion. But you see overall that there's lots of evidence to the contrary, and we see Americans before this war started were really against them and had a lot of different things to say there. And as we're going to see, this is kind of causing even more damage to American credibility around the world, because we say one thing when it suits us, and then when it doesn't suit us, we change our mind and we go somewhere else. And to help us unpack all this today, we have back on the show Matthew Ho, a great friend of the show, former State Department official, currently the Associate Director of Eisenhower Media Network, and just a great all-around guy, former Marine combat veteran. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Danny. It's good to see you.
It's actually been too long. I think we were talking about just before that. Right. I think the last time I even seen you or on the show was when we were standing in front of the British Parliament building about a month or so ago. So it's been too long. Good to have you back on today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me back on. That was a wonderful experience there. And it was really good to spend that time in London with you as well. But here we are now. And unfortunately, our attitude, our spirits are not going to be positive. But things haven't changed that much in the last few weeks or so.
Yeah. And in fact, you could argue in some ways they've changed for the worse, but hey, we're going to continue to call these things out because we are, after all, unintimidated and uncompromised on the truth. So let's jump right into that. I want to talk about a little bit, first of all, about what the Azov Battalion is. There's a lot of confusion on that, a lot of different things that are out there where people claim one thing and another. But when you take a look at the symbolism that the Azov Battalion themselves have chosen to use, you see that's just it's not just coincidental. Some of the claim that on these flags that you see on the Azov Battalion, and this is, by the way, it's from 2021. These images you see there, because they're hailed as a military heroes. And these flags that you see on the background there, they claim that it's actually a weird way to say IN, like international nation or something to that effect. But when you take a look at what they really are, and especially compare it to Nazi symbolism, it's pretty clear that it is directly related to the neo-Nazi or the Nazis of the past. And when you talk to some of the Azov Battalion members themselves in the past, they don't shy back away from that. I mean, they were absolutely neo-Nazi or alt-right kind of hardcore groups, even within Ukraine. And now then we want to, I guess they want to kind of rehabilitate them. And like so many other things we've seen, for some number of weeks, there has been some question of should the U.S. lift a ban that has been on place on the Azov Battalion for quite a long time. And now it seems like we've decided, yeah, they're fine with all that. Just what I've shown so far, kind of where do you fall down on what the Azov Battalion stands for?
Well, I think any organization that has a legacy is going to adhere to that legacy in the future. Ukrainians who join that unit know of its origin. They know what it has done the last decade or so. So this idea that somehow because they are rebranding, that they are no longer the same substance they were is a foolish thought to take, and only the naive and the naive and the gullible would fall for that. It's kind of like how many times did Al Qaeda rebrand themselves in Syria? They're still Al Qaeda, no matter what you call it, to try and get around Western sanctions, Western law, public opinion, and that's what Azov has been doing for most of the last decade. Essentially, I mean, starting in 2015, they try and depict themselves as a kinder, gentler, more tolerant and accepting organization, which they were not. And we know this because there has been, just story after story over the last decade in mainstream corporate press that has been incredibly friendly to the West's policy in Ukraine. So no one who is going to be, Dan, I'm sure you saw the list that you and I and others made regarding the most pro-Russian propagandists in America or something like that, that came out from a Ukrainian organization that's funded by the State Department. I'm sure you saw that. Yeah. So, so none of these organizations that were accurately reporting on the Azov battalion as being a neo-Nazi organization made that list. So even if you go back in the last couple of years, NBC News had a big story in Azov in March of 2022. So in the weeks after the invasion, NBC News, which I would probably say is the most supportive of this war in Ukraine among American media outlets, which is saying a lot, right? But then even go back just about a year ago, last June, the New York Times had a big story. And it was widely mocked because it showed just kind of what a sham the profession of journalism has become, because it explained how Western journalists in Ukraine ask Ukrainian soldiers, not just those from the Azov, but from other units, to take off their Nazi symbols that are on their patches and everything else that they're wearing on their uniforms. The Western journalists asked the Ukrainian soldiers to remove those Nazi symbols before they take their photograph. And so, I mean, this wasn't a big story, like just about a year ago in the Times, explaining how this type of pro-Nazi sentiment and admiration following is rife throughout the Ukrainian army, not just confined to Azov, but also too. And the story that you were talking about today is that the U.S. is going to lessen the restrictions on Azov, restrictions that the U.S. Congress put in place just 4 or 5 years ago against Azov, because it was so clear that this was a neo-Nazi organization, that even though at that point when Russiagate was occurring, when Ukraine war desire was starting to really ratchet up in Washington, D.C., these guys were so far gone that this is so clear that you all are Nazis that we are going to have to sanction you, even as we are doing everything we can to support Ukraine and hopefully start a war in Eastern Europe.
Right. Now, and I'm going to actually cover some of that here in a minute. I regret that I didn't get some of these images off that are all over the internet, where they're outright Nazi flags that are holding up. I just didn't have time to go and pull that, but there's a bunch of them out there. Anybody can see that. But Gary, I'm going to slightly change up the order of what I had told you to play here, but I want to jump here to what one of the Azov guys themselves claim is that actually, no, we're not these Nazi guys at all. That's actually Russian propaganda, as you can see here.
Sorry to say this, but the image of us as neo-Nazis was created by Russians in 2016, after Azov liberated Mariupol from Russia. Our volunteer fighters then became part of the Ukrainian army.
So it's just a misunderstanding that we're not. That's from 2022, where he said that. But let me show you something from 2021. And I'm going to be reading some of this stuff off the screen. Unfortunately, there was some music behind it, which we can't really show it, or otherwise we'd have some copyright infringement issues here. But I'm going to read. This is from 2021. So before the war started, this is the true nature of what the Azov Battalion members are proud of. Gary, if you can roll that one. The whole world is suffocating today from left-wing shit. Society is crazy about brazen, sick, perverted Antifa, LGBTQ degenerates, and separatism. Our enemy is trying to destroy a healthy European culture and history where our ancestors and our warriors come from. We are Ukrainian nationalists, and we warn that we will not allow this cancer to spread on our land. We will help our colleagues and ideological brothers in the world struggle. We are ready. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. So that is what they're very proud of, that they have this rightist kind of mentality that they want to get rid of everybody that they don't like, and they consider it a global struggle. And in fact, there was some other reports that I had seen that show that there were many in Congress and many in the administration who for years have been warning about that some of the alt-right people, even in our country, have been elsewhere around the world, have been going to the Azov battalion people for training. So you see that when we're not trying to say, hey, this is just what we want to do, this is what they are and why we had them banned originally.
Right. And if people are thinking to themselves, this sounds familiar. Where have I heard this story before? Well, it's, very simply the same story that occurs with the West, the American attempts to utilize Arab reactionary religious forces in Afghanistan that creates Al-Qaeda, right? I mean, so on and so forth. So this is all the cautionary tales exist out there because they are fundamentally true. When a nation like the United States attempts to use an ideological movement like the Nazis, like Al-Qaeda, like jihadist, Islamist, forces, etc., the blowback is always going to be severe. That our thoughts that somehow we can control these ideological forces by giving them money and weapons, everything that they want, so that they can increase their effectiveness in achieving what they're trying to do, will blow up in our faces. And I think that's what we're seeing here. You also see with regards to how widespread it is in Ukraine is because this is a continuation of history. I mean, this goes back, that divide between, say, Ukrainians and Russians that, for most of us, I think really becomes understood during the Second World War, but that, and then post Second World War, Ukrainian forces fighting Soviet forces with the support, of course, of the United States and that as well in the late 40s. So you have this history that exists of not just two competing ideologies, far right and say in the Soviet times, far left. But now, of course, what you have are competing commercial interests, competing outside powers, but also, too, this historic conflict that exists for some in the region, not for all, but for some in the region, of essentially Ukraine versus Russia. And so the historic ties are very similar to the ones that lead people into other ideologies, it's particularly when what then comes to pass proves true the ideology, proves true the movement, proves true the mythology or the history. So when Russia invades Ukraine, that proves true what these neo-Nazi guys are talking about. I guess they were right all along. I mean, you saw this all throughout the greater Middle East. How does the Pakistani Taliban get so much support from the Pashtun people of the West? Because for years, the Pakistani Taliban were essentially the crazy guy at the end of your village who's always going on about this, that, the other thing. One of those things being the West and how dangerous they are, and the Crusades are not over, etc. And then what happens? The drones start appearing overhead, and then the Pakistani army comes into your territory for the first time. On and on and on, proving essentially this Pakistani Taliban correct. And you see people join them because now they feel that they are under assault. That whether or not they actually believe in the ideology per se, but they are certainly seeing that these people are on our side against invaders, against the other, against foreigners, etc.
Yeah, and do you remember? I want to say it was about a year and a half ago. I'm pretty sure it was in the first year or so of the war when there was this big faux pas in Canada when an actual Nazi member was hailed as a big hero because he had fought against the Russians. And somehow it was lost on all the people that he was a literal Nazi member, not someone a Nazi sympathizer, but an actual who wore the Nazi uniform. And he was absolutely hailed as, standing ovation by all the parliament. Of course, in Ukraine was the same way. And and then
NATO just did it again, Danny. They recognized these forest soldiers, which were these Ukrainian insurgents that fought against the Soviets in the late 40s, and conveniently left out who these guys were prior to 1945. that they were adjuncts essentially of the SS.
I did miss that one, but
and they just happened to leave that, because I guess that's not important.
It's not important today. Today it's not important. Tomorrow it could be again, but this just shows the malleability of the absence of, and we're going to see this theme pop up throughout this episode here, the absence of any kind of guiding moral imperative. This is what we stand for. This is what we don't. I don't care who you are. This is what it is. But hey, if we want to change in the wind, if the wind blows a different direction today, and that gives us some sort of advantage, yeah, we'll change our values and just ignore them with no problem. But here's a brief report.
Just one more point on this, because this exists all throughout American, modern American history, and we can go back farther probably, but certainly say in the war you and I took part in Iraq, we had this where the Badr Corps was the most favored militia of the United States. The Badr Corps, of course, belonging at that point to the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was funded, supported, led by, you name it, it was Iranian backed, right? They are Iraqis, but they were in exile in Iran during Saddam Hussein's reign. They came in when we invaded the country, toppled the Ba'ath Party, and they filled a lot of prominent positions within the Iraqi government and their armed militia, the Badr Corps, which was essentially saying right up front that they're going to launch a civil war against the Sunnis. We've had them fill out the ranks of the Iraqi security forces, especially the Iraqi police. And what do you think they did? They did exactly what they said they were going to do. They launched a civil war. I don't want to take away any agency from the Sunnis as well in that. But, for the most part, my view, you saw this predation on the Sunnis led by the Iraqi government, which was populated by these people who said right up front, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, and certainly Maliki certainly facilitated that once he became prime minister later on. But here's where we are now. So let me show you this brief report that talks about how the Azov battalion itself was actually formed in 2014. And check at the end of this clip what we thought of it later.
The Azov battalion was formed in 2014 during the Russian annexation of Crimea. It began life as a volunteer force, which then became part of Ukraine's armed forces with public links to far-right groups. In 2016, the United Nations accused it of violating international humanitarian law. In 2019, 40 US Congress members unsuccessfully tried to designate the Azov as a foreign terrorist organization.
And Matt, that was in 2019, but in 2018, there was successful when some of the members of Congress put Azov underneath some sanctions. And Gary, if you can throw that 2018 The Hill headline up there, it says Congress bans arms to Ukraine militia linked to neo-Nazis. Now, again, you see that's I believe it was March in 2018. We expressly said this Ukraine militia linked to neo-Nazis, and one of the supporters of this, Rokana, said white supremacy and neo-Nazism are unacceptable and have no place in our world. He said, an outspoken critic of providing lethal aid to Ukraine said in a statement to The Hill on Tuesday, I'm very pleased that the recent passed omnibus prevents the U.S. from providing arms and training assistance to the neo-Nazi Azov battalion fighting in Ukraine. And now then it's like, but see, they're really good fighters. And by all accounts, they have been. So let's just ignore everything that we just said and give them our money.
Right. And that's the thing is that this legislation was put forward by Democrats. So it wasn't like this was a Republican initiative that now a Democratic administration is getting rid of or undermining or, diminishing or whatever. This was a Democratic initiative, 2018, 2019. So you're talking 5 years ago. And they've already turned around on it. We'll see what will come of this, I think, in terms of how Congress is going to react and whether or not they are going to, revoke funding. Revoke the legislation entirely. Right now, it's basically like a waiver that's allowing these weapons to go to Azov. But you just look at today they're marking up the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. And I think there's like 1,300 or 1,400 amendments. A bunch of them have to do with Ukraine. Some of them are quite sensible, like once again asking the U.S. government for a strategy. It's clear there is no strategy in Ukraine. This example being a terrific case in point, right? Where we don't even know who we're arming. We don't even know what we're trying to accomplish. We don't even know who we're allying with. We do, but we're going to pretend like they're really not who they are. So if you don't even know who you're, or not even willing to be honest about who you're allied with, who your proxies are, how do you have any strategy whatsoever if you don't even have that basic fundamental point? But we'll see what in the NDAA, what type of amendments address these types of concerns, either in terms of getting rid of any concerns or maybe opening up more concerns. It is interesting with the NDAA that the top amendment, of course, is the one, in my opinion, from both Democrats and Republicans, about 25 co-sponsors as of yesterday, that was arguing that was basically be an act of Congress that the United States should allow Ukraine to use whatever weapons it wants, wherever it wants, in whatever it wants. Russia.
We're gonna get on that in a second, because I have some things to say about that as well.
I'm sure you do.
But there's one more piece here that I want to put in terms of stripping away the facade of showing exactly who these folks genuinely are. Actually, Doug McGregor was on with Tucker Carlson not long ago, and he spoke about this issue about Azov.
Kolomoisky is the individual who's probably more responsible than anybody else for funding this atrocity we call the Azov regiment that runs around with the swastikas and Nazi gear and so forth. And he was picked and then blessed by Victoria Nuland and the State Department as their man. Now, when he originally ran for office, he ran on a peace platform. And he was overwhelmingly elected across the country because he said, if I am elected as your president, I will make peace with Russia. Ukrainians didn't want to go to war with Russia. They were looking for a way out of this and a resolution to the crisis. Of course, once he was in there, he took a different road. And I can't help but think that road was defined for him by us.
Now, see, you just see our fingerprints all over this stuff. So we know Azov, we know who they were, we know who organized them, we know what they stand for. I mean, it's out there for everybody to see. You can't even hardly hide it. And yet you see, with Victoria Nuland in 2014, we're already ready to say, yeah, if that helps our side, I don't care where they stand for. And that just, again, we keep coming back to that same theme, which you've expanded on in different the war theaters, that our actual values, the things that we say we stand for, don't stand for anything at all. And we throw them away in a heartbeat. And it sounds like, according to this, what you've just said, that the NDAA, we might be ready to do more of it.
Well, it's an ends justifies the means type of approach. And of course, it's never expressed that way. I think we'd all be much more sane, less angry, less filled with, venom in ourselves if Tony Blinken, Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, whoever actually just spoke forthrightly, as opposed to trying to dress all this up about democracy, all this dressed up about opposition to tyrants and authoritarianism, et cetera, as if there actually is any values that actually underlie or underwrite those who are putting these policies in place. They're not. These are men and women who are devoted to attaining and keeping power. And so whatever is necessary, and they also come at this with a very political lens. They're all American politicians first and foremost. They are political animals. They come out of political campaigns. So even people who have not held office like Blinken or Sullivan, they are come out of politics as staff people, as campaign people, as strategists. That's how they view everything. And so electorally here in the U.S., the system that we have, you ally yourself with what you do, whatever is necessary to get elected. And the idea being, of course, is that your opponents are on the same wavelength. You see things the same way. You're operating in the same environment, come out of the same type of culture. And then when you're dealing with people overseas, though, it's not that way at all. And I think this is one of the problems that we continue to run into in American foreign policy, is that our decision makers, whether they be Republican or Democrat, treat everything overseas as if it's an American domestic political problem, which it certainly isn't, and those who are they are now up against, as well as those that are also allied with, because, you know, God help the people that we are dragging through this, you know, particularly the Ukrainians, you know, they are subject to those whims.
Now, Matt, I want to show you something here. I don't know if you've seen this yet. So hopefully you didn't just eat lunch before I'm showing you, so you possibly could throw it back up, which is almost what happened to me earlier when Gary sprung it on me, because I hadn't seen it up to that point. But this crystallizes in one short soundbite here, the depravity. And I'm sorry, but I have to use that word in relation to what our senior officials are saying in terms of where our values have gone here, because what you're about to see is Anthony Blinken. He's talking specifically about something in the Israeli-Hamas war, but you're going to see immediately how this goes to all the things we've been talking about here and how much trouble we're really in.
What separates Israel, the United States, and other democracies when it comes to incredibly difficult situations like this is our respect for international law. And as appropriate, the laws of war. So we know that Israel will take all of the precautions that it can, just as we would. And again, that's what separates us from Hamas.
That's what separates us from.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
The
You know,
rule
I
of
mean,
law, the international rules-based order. What does any of that mean if we just flip the switch like a dime on something that's of fundamentals to our alleged values?
it doesn't mean anything to these people, and they don't care. They are, again, interested in their own power, and what their calculations are, what keeps me in power. And so their risk analysis is not the way we would do a risk analysis, say with Ukraine, right? With this idea of continuing to poke the bear, continuing to escalate. The risk is that Russia will respond in a way that is catastrophic. But what they see as the greater risk is that they look weak, that they are losing a war like they lost the war in Afghanistan, that this doesn't continue on with their Russia Gate narrative, which they feel has been successful, right? So what's the greater risk to them? Well, it's the idea of losing the elections versus a nuclear war. You know, I mean, this is how we have to understand these people. They are, I brought this up the other day on something else because I was reminded by it. You know, Jordan Peterson and others talk about these traits, these dark traits of people. And it's this idea of narcissism, sadism, Machiavellism, and psychopathy, right? And you see that expressed sometimes singularly, sometimes in multiple ways by various people. So yesterday, when the ceasefire resolution passes the UN Security Council, and immediately the American narrative, echoed by American media, is that this is all hinging upon Hamas accepting this deal, when Hamas has been trying to accept deals for the last 8 months, when in this particular deal, which is essentially the same deal that they could have had back in October, you know, but the United America waited until Israel had basically successfully carried out its collective punishment campaign, its genocide campaign. This is why we're seeing it now, because, well, Israel's essentially done in destroying all of Gaza. So now we can promote this ceasefire resolution, really bang the table about needing to bring about peace. Also, too, the Chicago Convention for the Democrats is less than 2 months away, and this thing needs to be over by then, or else Chicago 24 is going to look like Chicago 68. That's going to ruin the president's reelection chances. Not that he has much of those anyway. But, you know, I mean, this idea, though, of right away, the Americans, prior to the resolution passing, and then, of course, during her statement, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield saying this, and then, of course, the Americans across the board, including the compliant corporate media, echoing this theme that it's all up to Hamas. This is all up to Hamas whether or not this resolution goes forward. When, again, as we've seen, Hamas has been trying to get some type of ceasefire resolution before Israel even started attacking. I think that's the reports, is that immediately Hamas said to Israel, look, we'll give you the hostages back if you don't invade Gaza, if you don't come across that fence line. Well, I mean, so you have
Gary has pulled up here just for anybody who may have missed it. Here's exactly how that went down.
If you want a ceasefire, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to alleviate
the terrible suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to get all the hostages home, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to put Israelis and Palestinians alike on the path to more durable peace and security, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to prevent this conflict from spreading, press Hamas to say yes.
The last part just was the one that got me the most, though. If you want to keep the war from spreading, press Hamas, who's trapped inside of a fence. I mean, what kind of absurdity is that?
They're trying. I mean, what I understand is the U.S. is trying to get Qatar to kick Hamas out of Qatar and like denying Hamas any type of ability to operate from any third-party nation. That's the type of pressure that the Americans are trying to push on other nations to try and get those nations to put that pressure on Hamas, which is all meaningless, though. It's all moot because Hamas is not the issue here. The issue is Israel. I mean, since they
support.
I'm sorry.
And our support of that.
And our support, exactly. Yeah, I mean, so that, and so I think yesterday when Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, everyone is sitting at that table, the other members of the Security Council, the other 14 members, listening to her say how this is all on Hamas. And these people all know it's not on Hamas, that Israel hasn't, you're still getting at best mixed signals coming out of Israel at best. That's being generous. I mean, essentially you've got the Israeli government saying, no, Biden, this plan is incomplete. It's a lie that we're going to agree to it. Certainly the far right that is part of Netanyahu's governing coalition is saying, hey, if you go forward with this, we're going to leave the government. I mean, so maybe something has occurred in the last few hours I haven't seen. But as of today, no one can really say whether or not Israel is going to accept this deal, while Hamas seems to be conservative, leaning into it. And more than likely, they would accept it, I think. Unless, of course, there are some things that details that are.
I don't want to get too far off the bend here, but you see these things keep having ripples across all over the place. And getting back to the issue in Russia, Ukraine, as bad as all that stuff is that we just showed from Israel-Hamas situation, and it's terrible for our reputation and credibility around the world. Is we had Ambassador Freeman on today who just said it's basically been destroyed because we don't have any credibility among either adversaries or allies, because no one knows what we stand for or what we believe on any given day. But here's the practical ramifications of where this goes. So here's the risk. Now first of all, you have Blinken sitting there saying that we all about the rule of law, right? I remember something about that. And then here's Kirby a couple of days ago talking about how we're going to facilitate the attack of another country we're not at war with.
Right now, there's no change in our policy about the use of ATACMS, a long-range strike missile of 300 kilometers or so for use inside Russia. And again, I want to remind, the guidance we've given the Ukrainians is to go after things that are an imminent threat just over that border. Again, will we have to talk to them about what that looks like going forward? Probably so, but that's the guidance they've been given right now.
And then you had President Biden elsewhere on that same day in France elaborate a little bit more on what that means.
Let me ask you about what Vladimir Putin said last night about this authorization of American weapons inside Russia. He said the supply of high-precision weapons to Ukraine for strikes on Russian territory is direct participation in this war. He went on to say that this is the way to serious problems, and again talked about Russia's nuclear capabilities. Does that concern you?
I've known him for over 40 years. He's concerned me for 40 years. He's not a decent man. He's a dictator, and he's struggling to make sure he holds this country together while still keeping this assault going. We're not talking about giving them weapons to strike Moscow, to strike the Kremlin, to strike just across the border where they're receiving significant fire from conventional weapons used by the Russians to go into Ukraine to kill Ukrainians.
So, yeah, you can fire our weapons into a country that we're not at war with, and that's fine with that. Even though you had Vladimir Putin who said, if you do that, two things. Number one, there's no reason why we're going to prohibit ourselves from doing the same to you by arming your adversaries elsewhere in the world. Or if it goes far enough, we're going to potentially use nuclear weapons. And he had emphatically, Putin did the next day, said, yes, we would. It's in our doctrine if things get to that point. Right. And you know, and the question is, why do we want to take a risk of getting into a war, escalating something into that could potentially go nuclear, could be World War III, certainly a regional war that has zero chance of benefiting the United States by using people like the Azov battalion, throwing our values into the trash whenever it suits us? I mean, how does any of this help American interest, Matt?
You know, it doesn't, but it doesn't in a general sense, right? It doesn't in the sense of improving our interests, yours and mine, the people who live on our street, the people on our state, across the country, et cetera. But these people in power believe that somehow it helps their political interests, that among the base of support who are going to give money, work hard, and turn out for Joe Biden in November, Ukraine is still a key issue. They still see it as an identity thing for them. They hang the Ukrainian flag outside their house. And so the Biden administration, remember, their first campaign ad last September was a wartime commander-in-chief ad for Joe Biden, right? Minute-long ad showing how Joe Biden had gone to Ukraine, the first American president to ever actively go to an active war zone. I guess they forgot about Abe Lincoln, but
yeah,
right. I mean, like, you know, but whatever. That's all just, you know.
And they had that. I'm sorry, but they also had that fake air siren. It
was just so. I mean,
so bad, man.
It was so obnoxious and so disgusting in so many different ways. But yeah, this idea, though, well, again, cause and effect has no meaning to these people. They just willingly just ignore it. So in the case of, say, Joe Biden talking about how American weapons will be used to strike Russian forces across the border in Kharkiv, well, the reason why the Russians, or at least what you could say the stated reason is, was because Ukrainians were launching attacks into Russia from that region, including launching ground incursions into Russia, utilizing American vehicles. All these things that, you know, was very clear to see what Russia is eventually going to do. They're eventually going to expand the front and push into that part of Kharkiv to stop these incursions and attacks into Russia. I mean, so this was all a reality that was made by Ukrainian action that was directly supported and, of course, probably given thumbs up by the Americans. But that type of cause and effect has no meaning for these people. I don't know if I ever talked to you, I've ever talked on the show about this, Danny, about when I came back from Afghanistan in 2009, when I resigned, I had to go and talk to a lot of people in Washington, D.C., one of them being Tony Blinken. And at that point, he was Joe Biden's national security advisor. And I went in and spoke to him for quite a while, laid out all my reasons for why this escalation of the war in Afghanistan is going to fail. And he understood it all. The people in that room with him understood it. It wasn't like I was sitting there saying things that were incomprehensible, like I was talking some type of foreign language. These are all arguments that they understood because they are intelligent people. They are, I don't know how well read they are, but they're knowledgeable. And the idea being, though, is that these are also the type of people who can take that information and, again, do the calculation. Yes, I know that this escalation in Afghanistan is going to fail. However, perhaps we can get out before it really fails and we can blame it all on the Afghans. If we carefully manage this, we can use it to our political benefit. And of course, if we pull out of Afghanistan rather than surge in Afghanistan and a bomb goes off in Times Square, the president is going to be blamed for it. It's going to be said that that bomb went off in Times Square because he is weak. And so when a bomb actually did go off in Times Square, Obama had sent 70,000 more troops to Afghanistan. So you can't blame him for doing that. He's being tough on terrorism. You mean, so those are the types of calculations that come into their head, and it becomes very cynical, very cold. What is best for us politically? And those are the interests that these men, Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, those are the interests that they speak of when they say those words.
Now, here's what's puzzling to me. So I can get that you want political benefit and you want to take actions that you're going to be beneficial to your personal political life, that you can get elected to the job you want, that you can keep the job you want if you're somebody on the cabinet. But when you're taking actions that you mentioned a minute ago, talking about Blinken, that he understood. He was an intelligent person. He's not stupid. And he can see cause and effect, and he can understand how this would not, course of action one would not benefit me politically because it's not going to work. That seems to have been degraded somehow. For example, in the last year, when after 6 to 9 months of preparation, we backed Ukraine going into an offensive to try to push Russia out of the occupied parts of the Donbass and ideally go to the Azov coast and cut it off, et cetera. That's what all these people were talking about. And a lot of people seem to really believe in the United States government and even in the Pentagon that it was actually possible. Now, as I think you and I talked about before that happened, there was very many practical, fundamental reasons why it was impossible, and it was not going to succeed, and it didn't. So you would think that given that standpoint now, that given the understanding of how things actually work on the ground, that now we're going to trim our sails a little bit and have appetites are present on what we're going to try to achieve, so it's at least possible to be able to claim victory for the political, right? That's what you would think. But here is John Kirby on that same day talking about what he says, according to this clip, is Biden's policy on an objective for this war.
I think we can all agree, especially people that love Ukraine and want to see Ukraine succeed, that an escalation of this conflict to really become potentially World War III, to become the U.S. versus Russia, which Putin already thinks it is, could be not only disastrous for the Ukrainian people, but disastrous for people all across Europe.
Okay, that part sounds fine. Okay, yeah, we don't want World War III, but then when it comes to what his actual objectives are, what he's physically want to accomplish on the ground, he added this. Or at least he will in a minute.
We have to stand up to aggressors. You can't let them just change borders by force. And we have done that. And it's not just the United States. 50 some other nations have helped Ukraine try to beat back this aggression. And you're right about Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. That is Ukrainian soil. And they have every right to claim that soil back. It's their country. And we want to make sure they have the tools to do that and the skills to do that. And we're going to continue to provide that kind of support.
So then President Biden agrees with the 1991 Ukraine territory.
Of course.
Of course. 1991. In the 2023, when you had every advantage possible, Russia was on their heels. You didn't even dent the front lines of 5 things. Now that Russia's very much on the balls of their foot moving forward all across the front line, and Ukraine has suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, you want to claim that it's our policy to support an objective to the 1991 borders. It's absurd, and yet that's what we're continuing to go forward with. And so when we're authorizing strikes into Russia with our equipment, all that's going to do is possibly going to expand into World War III that we claim we don't want to do, but it can never work, Matt. So how do we square that one with wanting to have a political objective, but setting tactical objectives that are physically unattainable?
Well, I think, again, it's that politics is primary. And what you then have in relation to that is that what needs to move the politics or to maintain the politics is to have a narrative that supports it. And so what you have is this rather than narrative being driven by policy and being driven by the reality on the ground, narrative is what drives policy. And narrative is what explains the reality on the ground. So you have these two aspects of narrative, one being that when, John Kirby leaves that podium, when Matt Miller leaves his podium at the State Department, and they go into the conference room, or when they're traveling with the president or the Secretary of State, these spokespeople are they're just not given a script and they go up behind a podium. They are involved in the formulation of policy because they are the ones who have to sell it. And very often, because again, it's all about the politics, they are the ones who may best, along with the civilian advisors for the president, his political advisors, are the ones who are going to dictate what is best for the White House. So what you see there then is this idea that we have to structure our policy to support the narrative that we are currently riding on, right? And then you can see how that just continues to reinforce itself, and how you can then have to choose these absurd and obscene decisions, put in motion events like the spectacularly failed counteroffensive last year that saw how many lives, how many tens and tens of thousands of lives ruined for something that we knew wasn't going to work. But you have to have that spectacle to prove the narrative right, or at least provide the messaging for the next 24-hour news cycle, right? So as long as you keep coming up with a different story every day, keep selling it, and don't worry, no one's going to remember that you've already run this story 29 times in the last 2 years about how Russia's running out of rockets and artillery and munitions and everything. That's all forgotten, because again, it's just about what is currently in front of us, this 24-hour cycle. Stay on message, stay on the narrative. This is how we win.
Okay, I get that conceptually, but it has to work on the ground too. And so do you think that what they're just rolling the dice on and gambling at the roulette table, maybe, is it saying that we can keep that fiction going through at least the 5th of November? Yeah. And then after that, we'll figure something else out. But that's a long time between now and then for this thing to could go really bad.
Right. November 5th is the goal. So that on the whiteboard, that's what everyone's working towards. And everything else, all the narratives that feel around there, all the political action that occurs is meant to support that. And the military action is subservient for that. So whatever you need to do to get to that objective, which is November 5th, you do it. And that's how decision making is made. And then what also happens, though, is you have another aspect of this, because like anything else, there's no singular explanation for it all, right? But another aspect is that you have people like your friend Ben Hodges, who they can pull in, right? They can pull in, and he can validate what they're saying. So what you want to have is someone like Ben Hodges or David Petraeus or whoever, one of these failed generals, but have them, some retired 4-star, who gives you the idea that your plan is going to work. Oh, Petraeus and Hodges and Hertling and, Stavridis, they were all in here last week and they all gave us a big thumbs up. Hodges had a map and he put it on a table and he drove this little toy tank across the Russian lines. And then he put a HIMARS down and it shot into Crimea and boom, the war was won. It was great. So that's essentially what occurs. And then the political people say, well, hey, I've got, either they believe them or they don't, doesn't matter if they've got the cover, right? We've got this cover now to allow it to go forward, right? We've got the validation for our narrative. All right. And now
to your point about people not remembering, I do, but others don't. How many times did my good close friend Ben Hodges say that Ukraine was going to be in Crimea by the end of the summer in 2023? And said it again later in the year, and that all we need is some long-range weapons, even though they got them from various countries, and then eventually got even the ATACMS, and somehow none of the little toy tanks, he said, actually moved once they got those things.
The ATACMS and the latest, greatest example of how it doesn't work. This constant escalation, one more wonder weapon system after another, it doesn't work. It's not, you're talking about tactical effects, way at the bottom of what matters in the levels of warfare. So these ATACMS strikes, and now, of course, everyone's waiting to see what the F-16s are going to accomplish, which will be, we all know what that's going to be. It's going to be nothing. At best for the West and Ukraine, it'll be nothing. At worst, it'll, of course, be S-300s and S-400s shooting F-16s out of the sky in the first couple of weeks, and then you won't hear about them. We don't hear about the Abrams tanks anymore. We don't hear about the HIMARS. We don't hear about, because they didn't achieve the grand strategic effect that was promised. But you can't achieve a grand strategic effect with a singular weapon system. They teach this stuff at lieutenant level courses in the U.S. military, right? So this is what they're teaching 22 and 23-year-old kids who are becoming second lieutenants and ensigns. That's how basic this all is. But that, of course, for the expedience and necessity of the politics, get thrown away. And if you want to be Ben Hodges, if you want to be David Petraeus, if you want to be Admiral John Kirby and have those positions where you are the one who are going to go in and brief the president of the United States and then turn around and go right to CNN and talk to Jake Tapper, and then you're going to go to whatever steakhouse, and they're all going to recognize you, and some guy's going to buy you a martini, on and on and on. this is how you do it. You either are a true believer, which I think some of these guys actually are. I think they're crackpots, that they don't have a bright thought in their head, but they're way at the end of the bell curve, way at the far right end of the bell curve for ambition. So they are so they lie very easily. Right. Yeah. They lie very comfortably. And so what you see institutionally is replicated in these individuals, whether they be those in the White House, at the Pentagon, at the think tanks, those who are now on the boards of massive companies like Hodges and Petraeus and Stavridis and others are. I mean, like, you understand how and it goes back to what I said before about these traits that, people like Jordan Peterson talk about. Narcissism, sadism, Machiavellism, and psychopathy. And you could see elements of those, all those elements in some people. Some are solidly narcissists or what have you. But if you understand that and you don't allow yourself to forgive our system, right, to think, well, that's how it happened in the past, and I can point to all types of historical, historical evidence for how that happened, how individual personalities influence things. But now our history is different. The history we're making is removed. We always think that. I think a lot of us are guilty of that somehow our generation, our era is in a vacuum, and we can be informed by the past, but we are not captured to it. And, and then we can do a whole episode, Danny. Actually, you want to go into this whole thing of like, what makes history, is it?
Yeah. And here's there's many problems, but maybe the foremost is that aside from the potential risk that these narcissistic activities and ahistorical program, moving forward could spur a larger war, that's a separate issue. But I guess the main bill payer for all this are the Ukrainian people. The ones that we claim to want to help the most are the biggest payers of all of this fiction and this lack of integrity and this lack of knowledge about what strategy there is or how tactics work even. They keep paying the price. And it seems like if the Biden administration gets to November 5th, somehow that's a success, no matter how many bodies are going to be strewn in between on. But listen, in the last few minutes that we have here, I wonder if you can give me two things. First of all, do you think that we're going to get to November the 5th before something either breaks and falls apart here or expands out? And the second part is, if we do get to November 5th and they successfully do that, what happens next?
Yeah, gosh. When you talk about the Ukrainians, you're reminded of, I'm reminded, I'm sure other people are reminded as well, too, of what Henry Kissinger said, right, about how it's dangerous to be America's enemy, deadly to be its ally. And that's certainly the case when it comes to the Ukrainian people. Like, even if you had put a third
option, rich coming from him, though. But anyway,
yeah, I mean, I think he had his moments of honesty, right? I mean, so maybe those were one of it. But this idea that even if we had a third thing to discuss there, what if peace broke out today? We had a magic wand and peace broke out. I mean, the horror that the Ukrainian people are going to endure for generations to come, whether it's the fact that their land and industry has been destroyed, the environmental catastrophe is just at this point unknowable, and you're going to have generations of course, one, you have issues with families having to deal with the consequences of war. Their men coming home physically and mentally and spiritually destroyed. But then you also have this idea that generations of Ukrainian mothers, because of the toxic legacy of modern warfare, are more than likely going to be giving birth to deformed and dead babies for generations to come. I mean, so that's like, if we had a wand and we could wave it, Danny, and said the war is over, that's still what the Ukrainian people are going to endure. And this is why we need to end that thing, but, I mean, don't make it any worse than it's already going to be, than it has to be. So, this idea of making this war to November, I think is very critical to the Biden administration. Again, we look back and we see how much is staked on this, how much this goes to the core identity of the Democratic Party, how this has been for almost 10 years now, for 9 years, this anti-Russia, hysteria drummed up by the Democratic Party for domestic political reasons has been a key political point of theirs. You know, I mean, so how can you walk away from that? How could Joe Biden in the next several months say, yeah, all this stuff we've been going on about for the last 9 years about how dangerous Russia is to us, how they are an existential threat, how I've just what you showed that clip, how I've known this man for 40 years. He's a dictator, he's a tyrant, he's dangerous, but now we're going to make peace with them. So, I mean, the messaging on this puts them in a corner where even if they did realize that making peace, settling this thing is absolutely the only way to go forward, they would have a tough time doing that. Of course, they're not in that position. They don't view it that way. They think that it's manageable, that as long as the money can continue to keep this Ukrainian house of cards standing, that this can continue to go on. Escalation is manageable, which I think is something that, you know, throughout history, people have believed and then been shown otherwise that it's not. Certainly escalation theory teaches us this. People who conduct war games will tell you this. Escalation is not controllable. But what you then have is, of course, you have these commentators, whether it be retired generals or civilians, who then say, well, look, the Russians haven't responded yet. We've violated plenty of their red lines. So next 5 months, you can get away with it, right? So they get this confirmation from these validating sources who are absolute, again, crackpots who shouldn't be believed, but they are useful. And so I think that's the calculus, is try and make it to November 5th. After that, you know, there's this idea, they're clinging on this idea that the Russian economy is going to bottom out, that it's going to collapse.
Come on, man.
Right. I mean, or it's going to overheat. I mean, like, so they keep making up all these. But the other thing, too, is that what the Democratic Party does have to play is they are prepared for Ukraine to collapse tomorrow, for Ukraine to collapse in September or November, because they can play the stab in the back card. So whereas they've already set the table for this, the reason why Ukraine has not advanced, why they lost Avdiivka back in February, well, because the Republicans didn't give us the money for it. Why Russia was able to speed right into the Kharkiv region, meeting no opposition? Well, because the Republicans didn't give us the money for it. We would have won this war in Ukraine if the Republicans hadn't been so obstructionist. And so that will be their excuse in the next 5 months if things go really spectacularly, catastrophically bad in Ukraine, which there is a possibility for. I think that the money we provide to Ukraine, along with the Europeans, will keep them up and running through November. I think the Russians are not going to launch any type of offensive that would bring about the end of the war in a matter of weeks. I just don't think they have any plans to do that, nor do they have the wherewithal to do it. I also think the Russians are potentially thinking that, you know, maybe for us, the best way right now is a Trump election, a Trump win in November, because that's the best way we'll get to a negotiated settlement. With Biden. There will not be, because the danger you get into the Democrats, the same danger you had with George Bush in the Iraq war, is that Biden wins re-election. What you then have is you have this, well, there's no political consequence for me, so I can keep this thing going, right? Which is what Bush's was. Remember, Bush said about Iraq, it'll be up to the next president to decide what happens with American forces in Iraq, right? This idea that I can push it off. And so that then becomes the policy. We're going to push it off. We're going to punt and let the next president worry about it. I mean, so it's the danger here keeps spinning. You know, we're not getting any type of avenues shown to us where we can see a pathway out, even though the Russians have been trying to negotiate. We keep having to stamp our feet about this. The American media doesn't want to talk about it. It's coming out in drips and drabs. There was a big Reuters article a couple weeks ago detailing how the Russians would accept a ceasefire along current front lines that would then enable negotiations to take place. You know, Reuters reports that, and almost nobody picks it up. And if you read any of the articles in the Journal or the Post or the Times, none of them reference that. It's just you know, right? I mean, so I think the American political narrative is sustainable for these next 5 months, as long as there isn't some type of catastrophic collapse, which again is possible, but which they see as less likely. And so going back to this whole thing, they view as the greater risk negotiating a settlement, having to explain why they negotiated with this dangerous thug tyrant, Putin going against this dying year narrative of Russiagate that they think has been successful, right? So there really isn't the political cards being shown for the White House to say, yeah, the best thing for us is to end this war in Russia, even though there is that very real risk of escalation leading to World War III, as well as we've spoken about, the continued destruction of Ukraine and its people.
Yeah, that's what's, I guess, the most discouraging thing to me is that there is a valid political path to get to November 5th for the administration, and then a valid political cover to cover over whatever happens afterwards. Say, hey, ain't my fault. It was whatever. And the bill payers are going to continue to be the Ukrainian people are going to continue to pay it, or God help us all if it escalates. And that's the gamble that the current administration is playing. But they've seen it work for more than a decade, actually much more than a decade. And I think they're going to keep playing it. But
right. In this idea of the political drama that we saw this last year with giving Ukraine that $61 billion, does anyone think that's not going to keep going? I mean, that's dynamite theater for both parties. Right, that plays well for both. There are, of course, a lot of Republicans who are in favor of the Ukraine war, but for a segment of the Republican Party, this is a really good way to oppose the Democrats and the Biden presidency. And of course, with Democrats, this is their selling point. Look, the Russians are aligned with the dictator in Russia. We are standing up for, our modern day Churchill, Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv. The Russians want to abandon him. If they had been alive back in 1939, we'd all be speaking German, except for the people in Hawaii. They'd be speaking Japanese. You know what I mean? But you could see how that, right? You see how that is so easy to sell and to play out, and how it works for them politically.
Yeah. Well, we're going to see how it goes. And I can promise you, we're going to continue to keep a close eye on this, on all these potential fronts, whether it's the political, whether it's the tactical, or whether it's the expansionist possibility of the war going out. We're going to keep keeping people's feet to the fire. We're going to keep telling the truth. We're going to keep putting shows out like this that expose the paucity of any kind of morality and the crassness of so devaluing the lives of other people in other parts of the world to try to get to the political advantage for their side here. We'll see how much influence it makes, or how much impact it even makes, but you can count on us. We're going to keep giving you the truth here. And Matt, we appreciate you coming on and providing such clarity to this today.
Hey, thank you, Danny.
And we thank you guys for watching us too. We're going to have the ever popular John Mearsheimer on tomorrow at 2:00. You're not going to want to miss that one. Do tune in for us then, because we always get improvement and benefit from listening to John Mearsheimer. 2:00 tomorrow. Be sure to like and subscribe, by the way, folks, because that's one of the ways that we continue to give you such great programming here. It expands our reach, and that's one of the ways you can help. Is to number one, you can join our channel. We have a new join feature where it's an exclusive membership. Reach out for that too. That gives you things that you're not going to get anywhere else from, even within our channel here. Some exclusive things you get, but also every time we get those, it expands our ability to reach other people, to get other guests on, which further expands our network. So liking this and hit that notification button on there, all those things help to do that. So if you want to help us out, if you want to help us expand our reach to make more people knowledgeable like you are, do those things, and we'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.